Frank James Coppola, was born on August 10, 1944. He was a former police officer from Portsmouth, Virginia, who was convicted and sentenced to death for the 1978 capital murder of Muriel Hatchell. A co-conspirator with Coppola disguised as a flower delivery woman. To enter her home, the woman pulled out a pistol from amidst the floral display which she was carrying, allowing cover for Coppola and others to rush into the home. Hatchell was bound with Venetian blind cords, and then had her head was slammed repeatedly into floor by Coppola until she died. The group fled with $3,100 in cash and some rings from the crime scene. On September 26, 1978, Coppola was convicted of first-degree capital murder and sentenced to death in Virginia's electric chair. He waived his appeals and was executed on August 10, 1982. The first person executed in Virginia since the Supreme Court reinstituted capital punishment in 1976. He was also the first person executed in Virginia since 1962. After his September 26, 1978 conviction, Coppola dropped appeals and volunteered to have his sentence carried out. Convicted murderer Frank Coppola, who preferred death to death row, went calmly to his execution in Virginia's electric chair saying, "Take care of my family, my children." Coppola, who maintained his innocence, but said he wanted to be executed to spare his family further embarrassment. Mr. Coppola, who insisted he was not guilty, had said he wanted to die to rescue any semblance of dignity I had left after 4 years on death row. He sent the authorities a handwritten letter to that effect. At 2:30 p.m., about 9 hours before the execution, Judge Butzner ordered the execution postponed until the appeals court handed down a decision on a constitutional challenge to Virginia's capital punishment law. The law was revised in 1977. In a lower federal court, District Judge D. Dorch Warrener rejected a petition for a stay that had been brought against Mr. Coppola's wishes by Gray Lawrence of Norfolk, one of the lawyers who had defended him at his 1978 murder trial. In ruling that the execution should not be postponed, Judge Warrener said, "We are performing the legal equivalent of inserting tubes, injecting materials into, so that we can satisfy the quite appropriate urge to save life, not so much for the good of the client, but perhaps for the good it does us." Judge Warrener had Mr. Coppola brought from death row to a holding cell at the federal courthouse for a brief conference. Mr. Coppola's head was already shaved to facilitate attachment of the electric chair electrodes. With a reporter present to record the session, the judge heard the prisoner say that, "I have to be true to myself by facing electrocution. That's one thing I'd like to leave with my kids, is be honest with yourself," he said. Pleas for stay dismissed. Judge Warrener then dismissed pleas for a stay entered in the condemned man's behalf. The petition for a reprieve argued that Mr. Coppola had been so dehumanized by 4 years on death row that he was not competent to make a decision to die. The petition said further that his execution should await final federal court approval of Virginia's capital punishment law. A challenge to the law is pending in the federal appeals court here. Virginia has not held an execution in 20 years prior to the execution of Coppola, and there have been 4 in the United States since the Supreme Court ruled in 1976, at the time Coppola was executed, that the death penalty was a constitutionally acceptable form of punishment, at least for murder. The last previous execution in the United States before the execution of Coppola was that of Stephen T. Judy, 23, an Indianapolis construction worker, who was electrocuted March 9, 1981, for the rape and murder of a 21-year-old woman and the drowning of her 3 young children. Like Mr. Coppola, he had refused to authorize or cooperate in appeals to delay or commute his death sentence. Richmond, on August 10, 1982, the Reverend Father Joe Engel, a minister who accompanied Mr. Coppola toward the electric chair, said the condemned man was extremely calm and under control. He said, "Look after my family," Mr. Engel said. Frank and I gave each other a goodbye hug. He said Mr. Coppola never wavered in his desire to die. Shortly before the execution, a crowd of about 100 opponents of the death penalty gathered outside the penitentiary. Many held candles and carried placards reading, "Thou shalt not kill," and "Execution, nothing more than sanctioned murder." Although no media representatives witnessed the execution, and no details were ever released by the Virginia Department of Corrections, an attorney who was present later stated that it took 2 55-second jolts of electricity to kill Coppola. The second jolt produced the odor and sizzling sound of burning flesh, and Coppola's head and leg caught on fire. Smoke filled the death chamber from floor to ceiling with a smoky haze. Another botched execution. Thank you for watching Death Row.